Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror thriller film named The Undertaker. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. In the remote villages of northeastern Thailand, locals believe that after death, a person's soul becomes lost and must be guided by a respected elder. This belief gave rise to the profession of undertakers, who not only cleanse the deceased's body, collect their bones for cremation, and perform burial rites, but also recite prayers to release the spirit, ward off evil, and offer blessings. The story begins with a young woman named Bai, who was 8 months pregnant when she was cruelly abandoned by her lover. Devastated, she took her own life by hanging. When the village's undertaker, Siang, saw the resentment on her face, he dared not bury her hastily. Instead, he performed a ritual, cutting open her abdomen to remove the fetus and cremate it separately before burial. That night, he warned the village's young people not to wander the streets after dark. Hanging ghosts are among the most fearsome of spirits, especially those of pregnant women who are said to be exceptionally vengeful. Over the following days, Siang repeatedly performed soul-calming ceremonies, hoping Bai would accept cremation and find peace. However, each attempt failed. Left with no choice, he nailed her corpse into a cement coffin and sealed it in the cemetery temporarily. Not long after, Siang's youngest son, Joe, returned home. His older brother was delighted and urged him to follow in their father's footsteps as the next undertaker. However, Joe flatly refused, insisting that his dream was to become a judge. He was just a few months away from graduating from law school and had to prepare for his final exams. More importantly, he was terrified of ghosts. He argued that someone who sleeps with the lights on every night can't possibly handle corpses and exorcisms. Siang understood his sons had their own ambitions and didn't force them, but in their remote village, he was the only undertaker. He could only take things one day at a time. The next day, Siang attempted another ritual for Bai. He handed out eggs to the deceased's family and instructed them to throw them on the ground. If an egg shattered, it meant the spirit had accepted cremation. However, every single egg remained intact. Even the man responsible for Bai's pregnancy secretly tossed an egg, but it too remained unbroken. Just then, a guy named Siang stepped forward from the crowd, claiming to be Bai's former lover and therefore eligible to calm her spirit. Siang, seeing the sorrow on Siang's face, granted his request. To everyone's astonishment, the egg Siang threw shattered upon impact. Therefore, the cremation ceremony was scheduled for a week later. After this event, Siang became convinced that Bai had unfinished business. Desperate to see her one last time, he asked his grandmother how to communicate with the dead. Without hesitation, she told him about 3 folk methods for seeing ghosts: wearing an amulet backward, dressing in a dead person's clothes, or rubbing black dog's tears on his eyelids. Siang wasted no time. That very night, he harassed the village's big black dog until he managed to obtain its tears. To be extra cautious, he also donned Bai's old clothes and wore an amulet in reverse. However, when he eagerly opened his eyes expecting to see Bai, he was instead met with the grim, shadowy face of an elderly man. It's Bai's father. Embarrassed, Siang hurriedly removed the clothes and fled for his shitty life, leaving the old man standing in confusion. That same night, a group of daring young men ventured to the cemetery to explore. In the mist, Bai's ghost emerged, sending them fleeing in terror. Her spirit roamed the village freely like a Barbie toy, appearing to almost every villager who dared to stay out late. Even Joe, who had just returned to town, had the eerie experience of seeing her ghostly, pale face. Yet, no matter how hard Siang searched, he was never able to see her. Determined, Siang visited the entire village over the next 2 days, seeking anyone with supernatural abilities. He eventually learned from a monk at the temple that the village fool had a gift for communing with spirits. Siang spent an entire day begging him to help, but his efforts were in vain. Meanwhile, Joe's older brother had accepted a nursing job, leaving Joe to assist his father in conducting funerals. Their next case involved a young man's passing. At the funeral, the grieving mother knelt beside the coffin, weeping bitterly, before gently knocking on the coffin's lid. Curious, Joe asked his father about this ritual. Siang explained, "It's a tradition. Family members knock on the coffin to try to wake the departed, as if inviting them to have one last meal before their journey. Of course, the dead cannot eat. These funeral customs are not for the deceased, but for the living, to bring them comfort and closure. The living hope the dead find peace, and the dead in turn wish the living to move on. But Bai was different. Her unresolved resentment bound her to the mortal world. That night, she stood silently over the bed of the man who had abandoned her. Her lifeless eyes bore into his sleeping face as dark blood trickled down her legs, soaking into his sheets. The moment the cold sensation reached his skin all the way to his smelly butt, He woke in horror, letting out a chicken scream that echoed through the village. Sak knew Bai had not harmed anyone. She was simply releasing her sorrow and anger. He did not wish to destroy her spirit. Instead, he wanted to give her a chance to be reborn. In his eyes, death should mark the end of all earthly grievances. No matter how wicked someone was in life, once they died, all grudges should be buried with them. Even when villagers lashed out at the corpses of wrongdoers, kicking and cursing them, Sak always stepped forward to stop them. He believed an Undertaker must treat all the dead with equal respect. After exhausting all means to see a ghost, Siang turned to Sak for help. He eagerly flattered Joe, hoping to gain an introduction. Just as they were speaking, Sak suddenly collapsed in the distance. His chronic leg condition seemed to have worsened. Joe rushed his father to the hospital, where he learned the devastating truth. Not only did his father suffer from leg disease, but he was also diagnosed with late-stage colon cancer, and there was nothing more that could be done. Sak and Joe's older brother had hidden the truth from him all along, afraid it would interfere with his studies. After being discharged, Sak had to rely on a wheelchair, yet he still insisted on performing funeral rites. Joe saw all this and felt deeply conflicted. That night, Siang visited Joe's home and learned that the village fool had once experienced an out-of-body episode during which he saw his recently deceased mother. This gave Siang an idea. He wanted to master this ability and see his former lover Bai. Sak knew the process of soul projection but refused to teach him, fearing the consequences, as the boundary between the living and the dead should not be crossed lightly. The next day, Joe printed recruitment flyers, hoping to find an apprentice for his father. But most people were too afraid to handle corpses, and with the hard work and low pay involved, no one was willing to take the job. With no other choice, Joe decided to take on the funeral duties himself, so his father could rest. However, he was too timid to do it alone. He needed a partner. Siang, eager to see Bai's spirit, became the perfect candidate. Sak agreed to teach Siang soul projection, and in return, Siang quickly became Joe's funeral assistant. That night, the village chief was out making deliveries on his electric scooter when he suddenly saw Bai's reflection in his rearview mirror. Startled, he turned around, only to find no one there. But the weight of the scooter had noticeably increased. He pretended to stay calm and called Sak for advice. Shockingly, he told him to stay calm, saying that Bai probably just wants a ride. Too frightened to do otherwise, the chief awkwardly got off the scooter, leaving both the vehicle and Bai in the middle of the road. At the same time, Siang had obtained the secret to soul projection. Sak warned him that sending a living soul into the spirit realm was extremely dangerous and would shorten his lifespan. The most crucial rule was to return to his body before a single incense stick burned out. Failure to do so would result in losing a soul fragment, just like the village fool. Siang immediately enlisted his friend to help. He instructed him to wake him before the incense burned out. Then, Siang lay down with 9 betel leaves in his mouth and chanted the soul departure incantation. Soon his mind was flooded with memories. His reckless youth, when he had fallen in with the wrong crowd, racing Tesla motorcycles and experimenting with drugs. His grandmother, desperate to save him, had sent him to a monastery, forcing him to break up with Bai. The memory shattered, and Siang felt his body plummeting downward. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself standing on a desolate beach. It's the void realm, just as Sak had described. When a soul leaves the body, it can travel to one of 3 places: the void realm, the ghost domain, or the physical world of the living. Without hesitation, Siang plunged into the water, experiencing the suffocating sensation of death. When he regained consciousness, he was in a murky canal, surrounded by floating straw men and red chairs. Ghosts dressed in white roamed the streets. This must be the ghost domain. Suddenly, a familiar voice called out from the grass. Siang rushed toward it, pushing past the eerie ghost lights, and finally saw Bai's sexy silhouette. Just as he was about to call her name, he felt a sharp pain on his face and was abruptly jolted awake from his wet dream. Back in the real world, he saw his friend standing over him, wildly slapping his face with a sandal. The incense had burned out. At dawn, Siang hurried to Sak with a large incense stick, hoping to extend the duration of his soul projection. But Sak shook his head, saying, "The time is fixed. He cannot cheat it." The reason Siang had failed to meet Bai was simple. He had wasted too much time wandering. Seeing his determination, Sak decided to personally oversee the ritual. This time, Siang would sleep directly on Bai's corpse. When the ritual began again, Siang awoke on the same desolate beach, but now knew exactly what to do. He dove into the water, embracing the suffocating devastating sensation and opened his eyes to find himself outside an old warehouse. There, on the rooftop, sat Bai, staring at him in surprise. She asked him why he was here. Siang's eyes welled with tears as he softly replied that he missed her. Then, with a deep bow, he sincerely apologized for everything, for leaving her, for choosing the monastery, for not being there when she needed him most. He said if he had stayed, if they had gone to school together, she would never have met that bastard. Bai gazed into his eyes, her expression unreadable. Then, with quiet finality, she said, "It's over, and their love is gone." The scent of burning incense grew fainter. Siang knew time was running out. He needed to follow the light and return to his body, but he stood frozen, unwilling to leave. Instead, he invited Bai to visit the waterfall together, just as they had once promised before their separation. Sak, seeing the last embers of the incense about to burn out, forcibly extinguished it. Siang jolted awake, his face soaked in tears. Sak let out a sigh and warned him that he can only project his soul once per day. He must resolve this unfinished business soon. By the time the father and son arrived home, it was already midnight. The village chief met them at the door, insisting that Sak cremate Bai's body immediately. Sak checked the calendar and realized the cremation date had indeed arrived, but his injured leg was still in bad shape. He simply couldn't manage it. He asked for more time. The village chief was about to protest when he suddenly froze in place. It's Bai who had appeared in the distance, glaring at him coldly. Without another word, the chief hastily wished Sak a speedy recovery and stiffly walked away, never mentioning the cremation again. Sak decided to train Joe as quickly as possible, letting him gain hands-on experience so that, when the time came, he could perform Bai's complex funeral rites properly. Soon, their first job came knocking. When Joe and Siang arrived at the funeral site, they were shocked to find that the deceased was a foreigner. They couldn't follow the traditional Thai funeral customs, leaving them completely clueless. With no other choice, they called in 2 extra helpers, a bearded Westerner and a bald virgin monk, who fumbled through an iPad trying to figure out the appropriate rites. They giggled and joked the whole time, clearly not taking things seriously. In the end, no one knew how to properly handle the foreigner's funeral. Siang had to ask the family directly about the deceased's religion. When he learned that the man had been a Christian, he immediately hired 2 pastors to take over. Their first funeral was a total failure. Not long after, the village's wealthiest family held a grand ceremony for their beloved pet husky, who had passed away. The funeral was extravagant. Every 4-legged animal in the village showed up. The host even gave a ceremonial howl, and Joe and Siang, trying to be respectful, awkwardly sprinkled flower petals on the dog's body. That night, the village chief's son was at home, gaming and snacking late into the night. As a Thai monk, he was supposed to follow the rule of no eating after noon, but he never really cared about that. Suddenly, the window flew open. The monk didn't think much of it and casually walked over to shut it. But the moment he locked it, all the windows in the house burst open again, then slammed shut on their own. Finally, he realized something was terribly wrong. His face turned pale, and he bolted out the door, screaming in terror as he ran past the village store. The bearded shopkeeper, witnessing a monk being scared to tears by a ghost, couldn't help but laugh his beard off. But his amusement didn't last long. Soon, Bai appeared behind him, looking even more terrifying than before. Her entire face had rotted away. The next day, the village chief issued a strict curfew. No one was to leave their house after dark until Sak recovered. Meanwhile, Joe and Siang were still struggling to get the hang of funeral rites, constantly causing disasters. Joe, trying to crack open a coconut to cleanse a body, was so nervous that he accidentally chopped off the deceased's arm. Siang, preparing the cremation of an elderly woman, absent-mindedly asked the grieving family how many legs and heads their mother had. Then they were assigned to a Muslim funeral, where the ritual required them to manually assist with certain cleansing procedures, things neither of them wanted to touch. Their next client was a deceased transgender woman, and the entire funeral was decorated in bright pink. At first glance, it looked more like a Blackpink concert than a wake. To match the mood, the 2 funeral workers donned pink outfits and even applied dramatic makeup to the deceased. After a long and exhausting day, Siang finally found time to attempt soul projection again. He woke up in his spiritual form, stepped out of his house, and walked straight into a shallow stream. The water led him toward the waterfall he had longed to see, where Bai stood in her familiar white dress, waiting. Smiling, Siang invited her to play in the water with him, but Bai's face was filled with sorrow. She simply stood there, silently staring at him. When he emerged from the water, she was gone. This time, the incense had not yet burned out. The next day, the transgender transgender woman's funeral reached its conclusion. Heartbroken over Bai, Siang took the day off, leaving Sak to assist Joe alone. Watching his son skillfully perform the rituals, Sak felt a deep sense of pride. But suddenly he clutched his stomach in pain and coughed up a mouthful of blood. He quickly wiped it away, hoping Joe wouldn't notice. That afternoon, they headed to the cemetery, where Sak finalized Bai's cremation for the following day, entrusting Joe with the ceremony. Following his father's instructions, Joe carefully rehearsed each step. When he cut the final thread binding Bai's body to the world of the living, his father collapsed. Panicked, Joe wrapped him tightly in a burial shroud and raced off on his scooter toward the hospital. After emergency treatment, Sak regained consciousness, but his condition had worsened significantly. He was now incredibly weak. Despite this, he refused to stay in the hospital, insisting that he'd rather die at home. Back home, Joe's brother repeatedly reminded him to always smile in front of their father. But as Sak childishly begged for a bite of spicy beef, Joe's eyes welled up with tears. Once again, the love-stricken Siang used the soul projection technique. He saw Bai standing at the doorway, tears streaming down her face. He asked if she too couldn't bear to leave him. If she was willing, he promised to stay with her in the spirit realm forever. Bai frowned, urging him to leave quickly before she slowly disappeared into the white mist. Siang ran after her with all his strength, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't catch up. Desperate and heartbroken, he pleaded for her to stay, crying that he didn't care that she was dead and that she didn't love him anymore because he still loved her. The scent of burning incense faded, and Siang made up his mind he wouldn't return to his body. Just then, an unseen force yanked him back into reality. It turned out that his grandmother had doused the incense. When Siang woke up from his wet dream, he broke down, refusing to accept reality and repeatedly trying to enter the spirit world again. He had forgotten he could only attempt the ritual once per day, and it wouldn't work again until nightfall. His friend arrived with his younger brother, hoping to help Siang drown his sorrows with alcohol. But before he could take a sip, a girl lashed out angrily, saying that all he ever did was drink and do drugs. That's why he ended up being sent to the temple. That's why he lost Bai. She challenged him if he was really going to make the same mistake again, and if he wanted to be sent back to the temple for reformation. Then she added coldly that if he was really a man, he should be taking care of his sick grandmother. Siang sat there unmoved. Instead, it was his friend who felt ashamed. Without another word, he set the bottle down. Everyone knew that the girl had secretly loved Siang for years. After he became a monk, she had been the one taking care of his grandmother. She was a rare, kind-hearted woman. Finally, the friend's brother broke the silence, saying death can only hurt him once, but love can wound him over and over again. Siang didn't respond. He just grabbed the bottle and gulped it down. That day was Bai's cremation. Out of hatred, she had become a vengeful spirit, lingering in the human world. But out of love, she chose to let go. She refused to harm Siang, who still loved her deeply. That was why Siang was able to break the egg. Drunk and grief-stricken, he arrived at the cremation site, tears streaming down his face as he cut the white thread that bound Bai's soul. Joe solemnly drew the boundary between life and death. According to tradition, the living must turn away and leave, never looking back. But Siang couldn't resist. He turned around one last time and smiled at the unrecognizable corpse before him. Joe knew Siang wouldn't be able to let go, so he prepared to ignite the fire. But at that moment, his phone rang. His older brother was on the line, sobbing and saying that their dad is gone. Joe froze. It felt like all the strength had been drained from his body. His legs gave out and he collapsed to the ground. Bai's mother, seeing this, picked up the torch and completed the cremation herself. Watching Bai's body consumed by flames, Siang was overcome with grief. He threw himself toward the fire, screaming for them not burn her since she's his girlfriend. She did nothing wrong, and she died unjustly because of that scumbag who drove her to her death. Death always comes without warning. We never know when we'll have to say goodbye to the ones we love. That's why we hold funerals, to say a proper farewell. Joe had finally become a worthy funeral master. With the help of the entire village, he completed his father's funeral. He carefully replayed every word his father had ever said in his mind. Then, he gently knocked on the coffin lid, whispering that he hoped his father will get a good meal before he goes. Suddenly, Siang stormed into the funeral, shouting for Sak to help him enter the spirit realm. Furious, Joe clenched his fist and punched Siang square in the face. Siang fell to his knees, sobbing and begging them to let him see Bai one more time, and if Sak can't do it, then Joe should do it. His friends quickly dragged him away, taking him home. Even as they carried him off, he continued to cry like a giant baby who had done something terribly wrong. His kind-hearted grandmother rushed over to comfort him, gently stroking his hair with her frail, wrinkled hands. She tied a sacred white thread around his wrist and pulled out his favorite grilled sticky rice. She coaxed him to just take one bite. To her, no matter how old Siang was, he was still just a stubborn, heartbroken child, and no matter what, she would always love and protect him. The day Sak was cremated, the village chief personally gave a eulogy. The entire village gathered to bid farewell to the man who had dedicated his life to them. As the flames crackled in the cremation furnace, Joe wept bitterly. Thick smoke rose into the sky, and in the cheers of the villagers, Sak's soul ascended to a sacred place. That night, Siang jolted awake. His obsession with Bai urged him to reach for the incense burner and betel leaves. But as he tried to move, he realized that his hands were being held tightly. It was his grandmother and the girl who had a crush on him. Afraid he might do something reckless, they had held on to him, even in their sleep. At that moment, Siang finally understood. The pain of love can only be healed by love itself. He gently embraced his grandmother and made a decision. He would never leave her again. After throwing away the incense burner, Siang finally noticed the girl, who had always been there for him, without complaint. He decided to spend the rest of his life with her. Meanwhile, Joe bid his father farewell and prepared to leave for the city to take the bar exam. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.